the screen share working. And let me welcome everyone. I very much appreciate the chance to get back in sync and be able to share with you. This evening, it is my pleasure. Let's see, let me make sure I got my screen sharing working first. Okay. We get James Lucas' picture up on the screen?
Yeah, him and yeah.
And all right. We'll move that to the slideshow and get that to slideshow and start from the start. Okay. James Lucas is our presenter this evening, and he has been with us for several preliminary sessions as a participant. And I should warn those of you who are participants that every once in a while the call comes for you to present. In this case, we had a gap, and Jonathan Neville came through with his co-author as a person to present, and so we are fortunate tonight to have someone who is he's well educated, has spent a lifetime studying the Book of Mormon, and so he's an attorney who has lived in New York City most of his adult life, is now relocated to Utah, received his undergraduate degree from Brigham Young University and law degree from Columbia, and he's spent time examining the principles to help people working towards Zion, and I noticed that he focused upon combining stewardship, consecration, and entrepreneurship. Most recently, he is co-authoring with Jonathan Neville on the book, which hasn't yet come out, I don't believe, Where Did the Book of Mormon Come From? A Neo-Orthodox View of the Book of Mormon's Origins, Translation, and Destiny. And so his presentation this evening on restoring translation to the restoration will give us glimpses of the past, the present, and the future. In beginning the prayer this evening, I'd like to make a comment about it because the pictures that I commonly associate with the prayer are intended to have some meaning. And the first one tonight is simply a picture of field notes from Nauvoo. And you can see the imprint of those tiny pieces of type on the left part of that page. And in the second picture, you'll see some actual type with the imprints. And the third one, you'll see Deborah Higdon with discovery showing that the site not only is a printing office, but also a residence. But that's just introductory comment. Let us pray. Eternal Word, the thought behind existence, source and creator of all we sense or see, we bow in awe before you as finite creatures faced with the author of eternity. Yet you help us cope. You offer us hope. You include us in your eternal plan, telling us in no uncertain word that your purpose will be heard to bring about the eternal life of man. So we rejoice to hear your gentle voice and to bask in the sunshine with a cool summer breeze. Confident that you care, your words comfort that you share, yet we know better than to celebrate in ease, for the tempest comes, the thunder thrums, your word has challenge crucial to translate, and we are creatures of fuss and war, perhaps rotten to the core, yet with some eternal value to contemplate. So tonight, before you we bow, acknowledging somehow that our destiny is in both yours and our hands. And we ask your blessing in our humble Zoom call confessing on James Lucas, our presenter, and on all our various demands. For we recognize our weakness, probably with too little weakness. We're inclined toward self-serving complicity. And yet, given the translations we've heard of the promises of your word, we still have hope for eternity. Because of the blessings of your Son, Jesus the Christ, the Holy One. Amen. Stop sharing and we turn it over to James Lucas for his presentation, helping us to understand the word and its translation. James, the floor is yours.
I unmuted? Very good. So hello to everyone. I have, as Paul mentioned, participated in some of the prior sessions of this group after Jonathan Neville introduced me to the group, and a fascinating group of folks. So I'm very interested to present our ideas to you and to see what you all think of them. For those of you who were hoping to hear Steve Pinecker tell us why Protestant defends the Book of Mormon, I hope, Paul, that you'll keep after Steve and make sure that he does do that presentation, because I was very much interested in hearing about it. So I'm sort of substituting for him, but not to let him off the hook over the long term.
Scheduling for 11.
Okay. So, all right, now let's do the screen share. Oops. Oops. There, can everybody see my little PowerPoint here?
No, not
Restoring
yet.
translation to the restoration? Not yet. All right. How about now?
There you are.
Are we good?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So this presentation is based on, there we go, a book that Jonathan Neville and I have just completed and submitted to publishers. Its title is Where Did the Book of Mormon Come From? A Neo-Orthodox View of Its Origins, Translation, and Destiny. The book is a short book by academic standards, but we're told that that's supposed to be the modern trend for nonfiction, is for books to be shorter. So we hope that that fits in with the trend. Nonetheless, in this period of time that we're about this evening, I'm certainly not going to try to present the entire book. So I apologize in advance for saying probably more than once that there's more detail and more discussion on a particular point in the book. But for this particular presentation, we're kind of going to jump toward the end of the book, the last part of the book, and where we present a new model for how the Book of Mormon was translated. But let's do a little bit of background in order to get there. Obviously, one of the seminal events in the entire restoration movement is the production and printing of the Book of Mormon. And one cannot overstate the significance of the Book of Mormon to the restoration movement. In Joseph's time, many people claim to have visions of Jesus. So the first vision experience, while significant, was not completely out of the ordinary in his time and place. What set Joseph apart was the fact that he began his ministry by producing a 500 plus page book of New Scripture. He became a translator before he became a preacher. And these two groups were very different in Joseph's day. Preachers were, fairly common. Translators, however, were a rarefied scholarly group, based at seminaries or universities. And I think we sometimes forget, because they did come close in time to each other, but nonetheless, the Book of Mormon came before the church was created. The Book of Mormon predates Mormonism. And of course, in the early days of the Restoration, the Book of Mormon was central to the message of early Restoration missionaries. At least in the LDS Church, for a long time, our missionary work focused on the first vision as being the sort of initial presentation of the events in the history of the church. But in the early times of the Restoration movement, as many of you know, the first vision was very little spoken of. The message that the missionaries carried to the world was the Book of Mormon, and the Book of Mormon was used to introduce the restored gospel. So we asked the question, where did the Book of Mormon come from? Kind of a basic question, we think, and one which has become rather confused in recent times. Now, of course, the traditional original explanation is that it was translated from plates of gold. This is Oliver Cowdery's summary, which he published in 1834 in the Messenger and Advocate. This is, he published a series of letters essentially giving the first attempt at giving a history of the Restoration movement. And the first letter has this fairly well-known description of his experience acting as the primary scribe for the Book of Mormon, where he emphasizes that it was done by the inspiration of heaven and translated with the aid of a physical device, which he called the Urim and Thummim, or he said, as the Nephites would have said, interpreters. Now, the term Urim and Thummim is perhaps sometimes confusing because arguments have been made that the term was used to mean things other than the Nephite interpreters. We discussed that in the book. So I'm going to tend in this presentation to refer to the interpreters, just so that you're clear that what I'm referring to is these ancient objects that were placed in the box with the gold plates that was recovered by Joseph Smith under the direction of Moroni. So here's an excerpt from the Wentworth, what's known as the Wentworth letter from 1842, where Joseph himself is giving a description of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. So he describes the records were engraven on plates that had the appearance of gold. And then he proceeds to say also that the container contained with the records was found a curious instrument, which the ancients called the Urim and Thummim, because that had become a fairly common term by that time, but he's clearly referring to the Nephite interpreters that were included in the box with the gold plates, which he described consisted of 2 transparent stones set in a bow fastened to a breastplate. And then he says, through the medium of the Urim and Thummim, I translated the record by the gift and power of God. So clearly, from the beginning, both Joseph and Oliver, who are the 2 primary witnesses of to the question of the translation of the Book of Mormon, indicated that it was done by the gift and power of God, but it was done with the assistance of this instrument, which came to be called the Urim and Thummim, and which the Nephite, as Oliver pointed out, was referred to as the interpreters in the Book of Mormon. So this, I love this. This lithograph comes from a book that was published in 1893, and we can see this is basically giving us the traditional explanation which Joseph and Oliver gave, that the Book of Mormon, you see Joseph there is holding the gold plates, and then Moroni is handing him the Urim and Thummim, which in this picture is looks like a pair of spectacles, which people did compare it to. We'll get into that, but clearly this is the traditional explanation, and I'd emphasize that Joseph and Oliver were consistent throughout their lives, and a number of different accounts. We have an appendix in our book where we collect all of Joseph and Oliver's accounts, but they were consistent in saying that the translation process used the plates and the interpreters to produce the text of the Book of Mormon that we have. Now, of course, so that's sort of, I would consider the base explanation of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. But of course, there are other theories. Now, obviously, from the beginning, people were arguing for composition, that, this doesn't come from gold plates or special interpreter instruments. This is just something that was being dictated to Joseph's scribes. No one really disputes that the process was that Joseph was dictating the text to a series of scribes, the primary of which was Oliver Cowdery. But it's important for what we're going to discuss here to remember that while today the most common secular explanation is that Joseph Smith was the creator of the text, that in the 1800s, the predominant theory was that Joseph did not himself create the text, but rather was copying it from reading it off of a manuscript by a man named Solomon Spaulding, who had passed away by the time these events occurred, but that Sidney Rigdon had got hold of Solomon Spaulding's manuscript, kind of revised it to make it a little more religious, more Christian, and secretly sent it to Joseph Smith to serve as the basis for the Book of Mormon. It's important to, just for the context, to remember that in the 1800s, that was the predominantly accepted secular theory, although today in our time in the 20th and 21st centuries, most secular explanations assume that Joseph himself made up the text. So that's obviously one of the explanations which we have to account for, and so forth. In more recent years, we kind of have seen a third explanation emerge. Now, we call this transcription. It's the seer stone in the hat, which basically is, there were accounts from the very beginning that said that no, Joseph did not use, or did not mostly use, this Urim and Thummim that had come with the plates, or even the gold plates for that matter, but rather that the translation process, he used a seer stone, which he had found in his treasure digging days. He would put it in a hat, cover his face with stick his face down into the hat with the seer stone in it, and recite the Book of Mormon text to the scribes. This is on the right is one person's illustration of what this process was. In this particular illustration, the blanket is up that was said to have separated Joseph from his scribes, although other seer stone accounts claim that there was no blanket or separation, so that other people could see Joseph looking at his seer stone in the hat. On the left is a picture of a seer stone, or stone, which was said to be the main seer stone that Joseph used. There's a kind of torturous chain of custody, but there is a chain of custody back to Joseph. This was given to Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery gave it to Phineas Young before his death, who was a brother of Brigham Young. Phineas took it to Utah. Anyway, it got into the hands of Brigham Young, and then Brigham left it to one of his wives, and one of his wives left it to the LDS Church. And I'm probably missing a couple of steps there too, but at least there's a reasonable claim for a chain of custody of this instrument of this stone back to Joseph. And it was and is now preserved in the LDS Church archives, and was kept unhidden, or was not displayed for decades and decades and decades. But finally in 2015, it was brought out of the archives, and graphs were made available of it. So anyway, that's the stone in the hat, which really constitutes a kind of a third version of how the Book of Mormon came about. Now, as I said, these accounts are go back to fairly early times, or at least let's put it this way: the people who are looked to as the source of the seer stone in the hat accounts are original members of the church. People claim quotes, to cite Emma Smith and Martin Harris, who both served as scribes, David Whitmer, who was not a scribe, but who obviously was around from early days, and various other people as sources for claiming that Joseph mainly used his seer stone in his hat rather than the plates and the Urim and Thummim for the translation. We in the book, now I'm not going to spend focus on this because we have 2 chapters in the book on this, but what Jonathan and I have done is we went back and looked in detail at the primary seer stone accounts that are used. These are from Emma Smith, Martin Harris, and David Whitmer. Basically, and I'm going to kind of, this is just a teaser for the book. We really dug into them. We looked at them in context. We researched them. We researched the broader context in which the various statements were made. And we came to the conclusion that they were inconsistent and unreliable as historical sources. And that's all detailed in the book. Now, we do not contend that they don't exist. We agree that these accounts do appear in the historical record. So, obviously then if we're going to say, but, discount them and ignore them because they're not accurate and they aren't reliable, we have to explain why they appear in the historical record. So we present in the book what we call the demonstration hypothesis. Zenas H. Gurley or Zenas, because there was a Zenas Gurley Sr. also, but Zenas Gurley Jr. was an apostle of what was then the reorganized church. During his, he undertook a detailed survey in the 1870s of everything that he could find out about the origins of the Book of Mormon, which included interviewing John and David Whitmer, who were the only surviving witnesses, researching in the records, and generally doing a very thorough survey of everything that he could find at that time that bore on the question of the origins of the Book of Mormon. And he published it. And in his report that he published in a journal called Autumn Leaves, which I was not familiar with, but it's apparently a youth journal of the reorganized church, we get this quote. He describes how Joseph also, he was talking about, to put this in context, he was talking about the seer stone or the Urim and Thummim. And then he says that Joseph had another seer stone called a seer stone or peep stone is certain. This stone was frequently exhibited to different ones in order to assuage their awful curiosity. And we love that phrase, their awful curiosity. But he says the Urim and Thummim never, except possibly to Oliver Cowdery. So and we have other evidence that there are other sources that would indicate that Joseph would sometimes pull out a seer stone to try to explain to people kind of how the Book of Mormon translation process was being performed, because he could not show them the gold plates or the Urim and Thummim. Moroni had specifically prohibited him from showing this to any unauthorized person. And until the 8 and 3 witness experiences, the only person who possibly was authorized to see it besides Joseph was Oliver Cowdery, as Gurley indicates. So our theory is that you can appreciate how early people interested in the restoration would be extremely curious where these gold plates were and how they were, this record of the Book of Mormon, where it was coming from. I mean, I would be curious about that if I were around and attracted to this early religious movement. And the early saints were as well. And so we believe Joseph would whip out his little peepstone that he picked up and liked to carry around with him, kind of as I like to refer to it as his pet rock, and say, well, it's kind of like this. He put in his hat. So it's kind of like this. I have these stones and I read off of it and in fact, there's one newspaper account, which is much more detailed, from David Whitmer, describing a formal session at the Whitmer home where Joseph actually seems to have performed such a demonstration. So anyway, that's our explanation as to where the seer stone accounts come from. But what's interesting about them is that mainly, although they come from people who were around at the beginning, the accounts themselves, for the most part, don't appear until the 1870s and 1880s. And so our argument, which we make much more elaborately in the book, is that what these were basically apologetic attempts to refute the Spalding theory. Because if you could say, oh no, Joseph wasn't hidden, I saw him with his face in his hat and his peepstone in his hat, translating the Book of Mormon, that refutes the Spalding theory, which says that he was hiding behind the blanket, the veil from the first major anti-Mormon book, Mormonism Unveiled. And so he wasn't, looking at a manuscript like the Spalding theory says. So that was a way of refuting the Spalding theory. But unfortunately, to do so, they had to wildly inflate these few incidents where Joseph had made a demonstration and it sort of consumed the major account, which Joseph and Oliver gave, which said that the vast majority of the translation was done using the gold plates in the Urim and Thummim. Or as Joseph Smith III said, he wrote an excellent article about this where he repudiated the seer stone account. And he said, well, if there was a seer stone, there's still no doubt that the chief instrument, that's Joseph III's term that he used, that the chief instrument of the translation was the Urim Thummim interpreters. And so we have that excellent article by Joseph III on that subject. We cite that in the book. So nonetheless, the seer stone in the hat, which we call the Sith theory for stone in the hat, has become garnered widespread acceptance in the scholarly community of Mormon historians. So if you accept the seer stone in the hat as being the main method by which the Book of Mormon is produced, the next question is, if it wasn't from the plates, the gold plates, where did the Book of Mormon come from? So now I'm going to be summarizing other people's work that I don't agree with. So I acknowledge up front that I may be, not presenting these arguments in the way that their advocates would present them. And I'm, hopefully, when our book comes out, I'm sure people will make comments about our presentation of the theories that we don't agree with. But for purposes of this demonstration, we've got to kind of summarize, or this presentation, we have to summarize a little bit. So as we see it, they kind of fall into two categories. Once you cut yourself off from the gold plates and said the gold plates are not what the Book of Mormon comes from, you kind of have, the theories have gone in two opposite directions. One theory basically says that Joseph was getting a text, but he was getting a word-for-word text from a pre-existing translation, which he received either through looking at the seer stone or by some form of direct revelation. And so that Joseph really was not the translator of the Book of Mormon, but rather was working off of some nobody really knows or who who was the real translator of the Book of Mormon. We kind of, and this may not be polite, but we've coined the term MIST, mysterious, incognito, supernatural translator, to describe who was that really did interpret the Book of Mormon. One of the most recent theories that I've seen from these folks is that it was the three Nephites who in the 1500s traveled to England, learned early modern English, did a translation of the Book of Mormon, which they then took back to America and then put in the box and gave to Joseph Smith in some way, leaving intact the early modern English version of it. I don't know, that's one explanation that they offer, which has far more issues with it than it solves. Now, the other approach is to say that no, Joseph was in fact the person who produced the text of the Book of Mormon, but it was inspired, and the way that it came to him was through visions and general impressions. In other words, he didn't really get a specific text of any sort, because of course this is still assuming he's just looking at his seer stone in the hat and not looking at the gold plates anymore. And he would, so this version basically says that, he'd get these visions and inspirations, and then he would spontaneously produce, as best he could, a verbal description of these visions and impressions he was getting, which he would then dictate to his scribe. So again, this may not, we use the term shamanist to describe these approaches, which again may be a term that the people who advocate these approaches would not appreciate, but we've got to have some kind of a shorthand. So anyway, so you get, these are approaches that believers in the Book of Mormon, people who believe that it is the Word of God, have come up with to explain where Joseph got the text of the Book of Mormon from, even though he was not using the gold plates or the Nephite interpreters that came with the gold plates. So let's, okay, not too bad on time. So let's start with the shamanist explanations. These are the explanations that say the Book of Mormon came in visions and panoramic views of Nephite civilization that Joseph then dictated in his own language as best he could from these experiences. So the first problem with these explanations is that the Book of Mormon is incredibly complex and precise narrative. And it's just hard to believe that anyone could track that kind of narrative over 500 plus pages, even with the benefit of inspiration, if one was just receiving kind of generalized visions of the Book of Mormon events. It contains over 200 named individuals, including family connections. There's 26 different record keepers who are mentioned. If you go to the Jaredite record, there's a royal lineage, a genealogy with 41 kings, including rival lines, all of which are kept very, the Book of Mormon keeps very careful track of these royal lineages. There's different chronologies, it's since the time of Lehi, since the reign of the rule of judges, since the coming of Christ, which seemed their fit very neatly over a 1,000-year period. There's a convoluted geography with over 100 named locations, which those who follow, study geography, everyone agrees that the internal map is consistent. All these different locations, although we have to acknowledge that there's not agreement on it being mapped onto a real world setting, but at least internally, this convoluted geography is very consistent. So that'd be just hard to imagine that if you're just receiving kind of generalized visions, that you could keep this kind of in detail, keep track of this kind of detail over 500 plus pages. Not only is there this kind of narrative detail, but the Book of Mormon contains precise and varied literary forms. And I'm not just talking about chiasmus, but I'm talking about poetic structures, the organization, people have written books, which we again cite in more detail in our book, detailing the parallelisms and the literary forms and the structures that appear in the book. And of course, there's also a very elaborate body of work that identifies Hebraisms and other linguistic artifacts in the text, in English text. And of course, and then above all, there's this overarching and elaborate epic structure. And the Book of Mormon is an epic. We invoke Richard Wagner, we invoke J.R.R. Tolkien in the book to try to give a sense of the that the Book of Mormon as a whole tracks the traditional narrative structure of an epic, of a national epic. And again, work has been done on that we cite. So again, that would be hard to just track that if you're just kind of spinning words off because you're having some generalized vision. Um, and then finally, the last difficulty with this approach is that there are many witness statements. They have, they have their issues. Nobody ever said, I looked through either the Nephite interpreters or at the seer stone in the hat to be able to say, oh, this is what I saw. Joseph was the only one, whichever instrument you believe he used, to actually look at it. But nonetheless, there's lots of people who gave various accounts of how the Book of Mormon was translated. And despite the differences between them, one thing they all agreed on is that everyone understood that Joseph was receiving a text in English. That's one thing that, regardless of, were they getting explanations from Joseph? Some said, Joseph told me that this is how it worked. So, and those people, but everybody understood that what Joseph was getting was not, some generalized vision, but he was getting something in English that he was translating. And that, of course, would contradict the shamanistic explanation. Okay, so the difficulties of the mist explanation. This is the mysterious incognito supernatural translator. In other words, Joseph wasn't actually being a translator. He was just reciting a text that he was getting either from the seer stone or through some kind of direct revelation, but it was word for word. He was getting word for word what the Book of Mormon should be, and he really had no intellectual input into it. It was a double team of transcribers. Joseph would just read a word for word text off of however he was receiving it, and the scribe would write it down. And neither one of them had anything really input into what was in the text. So the first difficulty with this explanation is that it's clear that the Book of Mormon's language is from Joseph's world. Now, a lot of people have made this argument. A lot of composition advocates who say, Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon have done elaborate work over many decades showing all the connections between Joseph's world and the text of the Book of Mormon. But I think, so my colleague, Jonathan Neville, and I think he has discussed this in some of his previous presentations, has now posted online what we call the non-biblical intertextuality database, which is basically what he did was he took all of the non-biblical language and phrases in the Book of Mormon, and then he's scoured the things that would have realistically been available to Joseph Smith. And he has been able to match up just about everything in the Book of Mormon with some source that was available to Joseph Smith. Now, obviously, the thing now this includes many things: family, language. We have a book from Lucy Smith, and that was dictated by her, so that kind of gives you a sense of how the Smith family, what their language was like. The local newspapers, Jonathan scoured the Palmyra Register and other newspapers to see how a local newspaper was written. Popular books like The Late War and so forth that were in Joseph's immediate environment. And of course, one of the surprise discovery of this research, which Jonathan has reported on to this group before, was discovery that much of this language in the Book of Mormon corresponds to language from Jonathan Edwards. And of course, Jonathan has written another book all about that. But nonetheless, this is, he's now posted this database, which is now 1,500, 1,600 pages. He's always playing with it and updating it. But that's now online for everyone to look at. So basically, the Book of Mormon, we can trace all of its language to Joseph Smith's environment. So there's really, the contention that it was actually written in the 1500s or written by some other translator is hard to maintain when, in fact, all the book's language and vocabulary and lexicon can be traced to Joseph Smith's immediate environment. Okay, there are, let's see, another problem with these accounts about a very tightly controlled translation is that, again, while they come from or are attributed to a lot of people who were there from the beginning, like Martin Harris and David Whitmer, most of the actual sources that where it's written down, again, come from much late. They're very late. They come from the 1870s and 1880s, and often they're posthumous. You know, especially Emma Smith and Martin Harris, everything that both people cite from them are from posthumous accounts that were published not until after they had died. Interestingly, a lot of these accounts come also with in the same context as the Searstone accounts. And so we concluded that this aspect of these late accounts are, again, exaggerated, distorted, unreliable. But, you know, we need to acknowledge that the folks who brought these forward, such as David Whitmer, you know, were doing so sincerely as defenders of the Book of Mormon to rebut the Spalding theory. But basically, they let their, you know, their apologetic efforts have run away with them, and it resulted in distorted and unreliable accounts. And particularly with regard to this explanation, everyone, no matter whether they're Searstone, whether they broke with Joseph or stayed with Joseph or whatever, no one that we have found has ever suggested that there was any translator other than Joseph. So this is just really an explanation that is on that point is devoid of any kind of historical. You know, the Searstone accounts are there, so, you know, we have to acknowledge those, but there's simply no one who ever suggested the idea that anybody understood that, you know, there was anybody other than Joseph being the source of this book. Other points are that the tight translation exposes the Book of Mormon to criticisms such as anachronisms and use of King James language, which can be explained if Joseph was instead an actively engaged translator. You know, when you're a translator and you're actively translating, you've got to translate the into the language that you know. So why would it be surprising that the language in the Book of Mormon can be found in Joseph's environment? What other language would Joseph have available to him to translate it into if he was acting as a genuine translator? And then finally, you have the point that, well, there's a big point to come on the next page, but then Joseph himself made hundreds of changes in the 1837 and 1840 editions of the Book of Mormon, some of the type of which Paul may have discovered in his researches, recent excavations. You know, if this was dictated word for word from God, why on earth would Joseph be justified in making so many changes to subsequent editions? And while many of the changes were just grammatical cleanup, there were substantive changes also, as critics of the Book of Mormon have pointed out many times. So that's hard to square with the idea that this was a text given word for word from God. Probably, though, the biggest problem with these explanations is it contradicts the scripture. We do have a scripture, a revelation, which is in both section 9 of both the LDS and Community of Christ Doctrine and Covenants. It's a revelation received very early. This was the revelation when Oliver was authorized to try to undertake translating himself, and he wasn't able to do it. And so then this revelation was given, which is a very highly regarded revelation, at least I know in the LDS Church, because it kind of gives some instruction on how one receives revelation. And it says this in the Community of Christ, it's a single verse, but this is the versification from the LDS version. The Lord says to Oliver, you thought that all you had to do was ask me, but you had to study it out in your mind and then ask me if it be right. And if it's right, I will cause your bosom to burn within you. If it's not right, shall have no such feelings, but shall have a stupor of thought. And so clearly, the revelation says that there must be some kind of intellectual activity on the translator's part in order to translate the Book of Mormon. Okay, and another final problem, I'm going to rush ahead here, is that a lot of people talk about how fast the Book of Mormon was produced, but when you actually look at it, it was actually slow. If you take the Book of Mormon, and let's take the traditional 75-day timeline, and you sat down and have one person read out the Book of Mormon, another person write it out longhand, you can get through the Book of Mormon easily in in a very short period of time. You can write out 10, 20 pages a day and in just a few hours. It's really not, if you're just dictating straight out, it's really not an overwhelming task. And yet we have this quote from David Whitmer, who, although we question a lot of what David said, when he's a firsthand witness, we're willing to accept it. And he was around the house when Joseph and Oliver were dictating the first part of the Book of Mormon, First Nephi through Words of Mormon. And he told E.C. Briggs, who published this account in the Saints Herald in 1884, the boys, now of course, Joseph, this is 1884, so David's in his 80s, so he's looking back, although they were all about the same age, worked long and hard, early and late, while translating the plates. It was a slow work, and they could only write a few pages a day. So if this is something that you're just reading off a dictation from some other translation that somebody else has written, where on earth would it take so long to produce such a dictation? This implies that there again was some kind of major work being done to produce the Book of Mormon. Okay, so we now reached the dilemma point. What on earth are we going to do to explain how the Book of Mormon was produced? So I would like to introduce you all to a new character who has not been previously cited in Book of Mormon studies or in Mormon studies at all. This is the Reverend Dr. Eugene A. Nida. Reverend Nida was the Secretary General of the American Bible Society for over 40 years. He oversaw hundreds of Bible translations. In addition to having a PhD in linguistics from the University of Michigan, he was an ordained Baptist minister. And he, but most importantly, for our purposes, he developed theories and approaches to translation which not only have universally impact Bible translation in our time. He is the giant, he is the dean of Bible translation in our time, but his views have carried over into all translation work. You go into any kind of translation scholarship and Eugene Nida's concepts are found. He was a towering figure in the field of translation studies up until his death in 2011 at the age of 96. So I'm now going to grossly summarize Eugene Nida's theories, but this is kind of some basic concepts which we will now we will apply to the Book of Mormon. So Reverend Nida saw translation as being a continuum between kind of two poles, if you will. But these are not binaries. This is a continuum. You have what he called formal equivalents. These are literalistic translations which adhere faithfully to the source text in phrasing and even grammar. So when and this was the traditional approach to Bible translation. This is why the King James Version seems awkward to us. And a lot of people think, well, that's because I don't know 1600s English. But actually, one of the major problems that you have in understanding the King James Version is that the King James translators deliberately tracked the Hebrew and Greek very closely, because that they felt was the most authentic way to do the translation. So it's not just the 1600s English, it's the fact that we're adhering very closely to the Greek and Hebrew language and so forth. So that's, but the argument is that if I'm translating this text, I want to be as close to the text as possible. So you obviously can't do it word for word because that produces something that's incoherent, but I'm going to try to get as close as I can to the original while still producing something that's grammatically coherent in my language that I'm translating it into. So Reverend Nida introduced a concept which was originally called dynamic equivalence, but he later preferred the term functional equivalence. And that's where he said, the task of the translator is not to translate words. The task of a translator is to translate meaning. So therefore, don't worry about how it was phrased in the original language. You need to put your text, and of course, in most cases, originally, when he developed his theory, he was talking about translating the Bible. So this is a very serious translation task. He said, you need to phrase it in a way that's going to mean something to what the target audience. He liked the term receptor audience. And it doesn't matter if the Greek or the Hebrew said this or that. You need to understand what that meant in the Greek or the Hebrew, and you've got to restate it in the receptor language in a way that people will recognize as being their language. And if that means that you've got to wander away from the Greek and the Hebrew, fine, you do that. Your job is to translate meaning, not words. So this is functional equivalence. And it's not like I said, it's not a binary, it's a continuum. So now we applied Reverend Nida's framework to the Book of Mormon. Now this could be very controversial, but we see 4 basic characteristics of the Book of Mormon text. One is that the language does come from Joseph's environment. Second, there's a substrata underlying all this 1820s American English. There are lots of ancient language artifacts. There are Hebraisms, there are phrases and so forth that have ancient connections. 3 was this complex narrative and structure, which I was describing before, where there's extremely detailed, extremely precise structure to the Book of Mormon. And finally, it uses the King James Version of the Bible. It's clear that Joseph was tracking the King James Version of the Bible in the sections of not in 2 ways. One, in the sections where it overlaps the Bible, he clearly, he was following the King James Version. And secondly, obviously the style of the Book of Mormon, even when it's not a direct quote from the Bible, is very much in the King James style, or an attempt to imitate the King James style. So if we analyze our theories that we've been coming up with against these characteristics, we would argue that all of them come up short. So these are all the stone in the hat accounts. So composition, obviously people will say, well, Joseph Smith just wrote it, they're in the stone in the hat account. They all accept that Joseph was looking at a stone in his hat. So they have to be counted in with the shamanist and the mist advocates who do believe the Book of Mormon is God. So the language from Joseph's environment, composition people can account for that. The shamanist people, they are saying, well, Joseph had to make up, describe the visions he was having in his own language, so that's okay, but it completely contradicts. The mist account can't account for that at all. Ancient language artifacts, now here, the composition and shamanists, they can't account for that. Why these ancient Hebrew forms would be underlying the English text. The mist account can, because it's a word-for-word translation. The complex narrative, here again, the composition and the shamanist cannot, so they're assuming that Joseph is basically just spinning this out off the top of his head. They can't account for that. The mist account can. However, when we get back to the King James Bible, while composition people can account for it by saying that Joseph was just copying the King James Bible, neither the shamanist or the mist accounts can account for the fact that the King James Bible was being used. So we would argue, and I know the advocates of these views will, get very upset at this summary dismissal of their theories, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot about that when our book comes out. But nonetheless, we feel that all the Stone and Cat accounts fail in one way or another to account for the Book of Mormon text. Okay, we're going to get done here in just a few minutes. Okay, so this part I'm going to kind of skip through real quickly. So now let us go back to the plates and the interpreters, the original Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery explanation about where the text comes from. So let's look a little bit more at the interpreters. They were compared to spectacles or old-fashioned eyeglasses by people who saw them, but they weren't exactly like spectacles. David Whitmer said that they were much larger than spectacles. Martin Harris said that the stones were translucent rather than transparent. So they were clearly not exactly like spectacles, even though that's how they were often portrayed. This is the best illustration I could find of the descriptions of the Urim and Thummim, but even this has its problems. Okay, so real quick, I'm sorry, I'm running over my time here, but so let's just, this is a quick thought experiment. Let's think of a device. It's handheld, has visual displays. It can be used to scan characters and translate characters from another language and display their meanings in the user's language. It will also provide transliterations of unknown words, and it has other communication and information display capabilities. That's I'm describing a device. Now, what does that describe? It describes both the Urim and Thummim and a modern cell phone. So in 1830, both the interpreters and the seer stone seem fantastical. And we would argue that today, the Urim and Thummim interpreters, as they are described, are actually completely plausible. Now, there are some differences that we go into in the book between what the Urim and Thummim could do and that even our modern technology is not capable of. But we would argue that the interpreters basically are completely, the way they're described, their functionality is described, is quite plausible in our modern society, as bizarre as they may have seemed to people in the time of Joseph Smith. So we cite Arthur C. Clarke, the famous science fiction author's third law: any sufficiently advanced technology will be indistinguishable from magic. So in the 1830s, it seemed when they described the interpreters that it was folk magic. That was the closest they could think, was the seer stones that practitioners of folk magic were involved with. But we would argue that this is an example of Arthur C. Clarke's third law. It seemed like magic to the people in the 1830s, but all it really is, the Urim and Thummim really is an incredibly advanced technology. Okay, give me 2 more minutes, and I will now tell you how the Book of Mormon was translated. So our new theory of the Book of Mormon translation is this. We believe that it was based on the interpreters and the gold plates. Joseph was working, like he and Oliver said, from the gold plates using the Urim and Thummim. We have accounts that Oliver gave where he said that Joseph scanned over the gold plates with the interpreters. That was how it worked, which is very much how you might well do it if you're using a technological device today. We propose that what the interpreters gave Joseph was a formal equivalent version of the Nephite text in English. In other words, something that was very literalistic, very close to being word for word. Joseph then had to study out in his mind how to render a functionally equivalent presentation into contemporary English of the meaning of the literalistic formal equivalent language that the interpreters were giving him. And this is just a speculation, but we could imagine him maybe using Oliver as a sounding board as he was trying to figure out how to express this in the English of their time. Having studied it out in his mind, he would then seek spiritual confirmation of the proposed functionally equivalent rendering into the receptor language, which was the American English of the 1820s. And then, guided by the Holy Spirit, as it says in Doctrine and Covenants 9, he would then have the text written by the scribe, or he'd revise it. Now, so I'll skip through this. A lot of you are familiar with the task of translation. So a translator has to do lots of things. He has to deal with colloquialisms, metaphors. He has to decide if you're being a functionally equivalent translator, like Reverend Nida advocated. You have to think of the social context of the receptor audience, think how it would be received by the receptor audience. You have to figure out if you maybe need to elaborate or expand on the text in order to convey a correct meaning to the receptor audience. And you have to choose a style and a tone that the receptor audience will respect, which is, we will argue, and this is much more elaborated in the book, explains why the King James Bible was used, and rhetoric from Jonathan Edwards, because that was very high prestige language, and this was the word of God. So Joseph was trying to use the most prestigious kinds of language that he knew. And of course, there are variations by the inspiration. Now, this is a very complicated process. Why this complicated process? I'm really 1 minute away from ending. So we go back to Reverend Nida. Reverend Nida said that translators do not translate language, but texts. The essential skill of translators is being able to understand correctly the meaning of a source text. So taking our lead from Reverend Nida, so this is perhaps the heart of our theory, which is that Joseph had a defect as a translator, which is that he didn't know Nephite. So by having a literalistic version of the rendering of the Nephite provided to him by the interpreters, this enabled him to bridge that gap, that shortcoming, by giving him the closest possible sense of what the Nephite authors were saying in their own voices. When you're reading something that's very literalistic, very formal equivalent, you get a feel for what Nephi was really saying, what Mormon was really saying. And then having that and the understanding of what the original authors were saying in as close to their own voices as possible, then you can study it out in your mind, and with the aid of the Holy Spirit, come up with a way of expressing it in your own language, the receptor language. So if we go back to our 4 characteristics, we believe this approach accounts for the way the Book of Mormon is. There's language from Joseph's environment. As an actively engaged translator, Joseph would use his own vocabulary and environment to produce a functionally equivalent text, which his receptor audience could relate to. However, when it comes to ancient language artifacts, because he was getting from the interpreters a rather literal, formal equivalent base, language forms from the original text would tend to flow through into the translated text. The complex narrative and structure, because he was translating from the plates, and because the authors of the plates had much more time to organize the text and create elaborate narrative structures and so forth, using the interpreters would assure the preservation of the detail and structure that was put in place by the original authors. And finally, the use of the King James Bible. Reverend Nida was very adamant that in producing a functionally equivalent translation, in other words, one that had meaning for the receptor audience, one had to respect the existing scriptural heritage of the receptor audience. And as I'm sure you know, in 1820s America, the King James Bible had vast prestige. And so that was why Joseph had to use the King James Version, because basically the people of his receptor audience in the 1830s wouldn't have accepted the Book of Mormon if it didn't track the King James Version where there was overlap. And we have a lot of discussion about that and some great stuff about that. So to conclude, here's a quote from Richard Bushman, which says that translators, we can't cover everything. What a translator has to do is form the facts as best they can to best account for the facts and form them into a convincing story. So we're not arguing that this is absolutely the final definitive answer. We present this as a useful working hypothesis, which we believe better explains the text of the Book of Mormon and why it is the way it is than other explanations, but we acknowledge that the record is complex. Now, our hypothesis is not naturalistic. A couple of people who we described it to say, well, that's a naturalistic explanation. But, we still have plenty of mystery and religion in we accept the historicity of the Book of Mormon, we accept that the plates and the interpreters were real, and we accept that there were guidance of angels and the Holy Spirit throughout the process. However, to conclude, by framing the origins of the Book of Mormon in terms of technology and personal revelation, which we believe that Latter-day Saint believers can relate to, we hope that this would make the Book of Mormon more approachable and relatable to a tech-drenched 21st century receptor audience. So we will be presenting this in our book as a new way of looking at the translation of the Book of Mormon. And oops, I'm only over by a few minutes, I apologize. But that's a quick summary of some of the points that we make in our book, all of which are, laid out in much more elaboration in the book.
Thank you, Brother Lucas, for that presentation. I am intrigued that we have need then, if I understand you correctly, to be translating the text again for a new generation of people that haven't come to grips with it yet.
Well, we're not saying, well, there's a famous quote, well, not famous quote, but it's become a kind of well-known quote from Brigham Young, who in 1862 told an audience that if the Book of Mormon were translated today, he's talking in 1862, I'm sure it would read very differently than it did back then in 1830 when it was originally translated. So he clearly had the concept that the translation was a volitional intellectual activity on Joseph's part, but we're not proposing that it be retranslated. Among other things, we don't have the original text, so how could we retranslate it? But by understanding the translation in this way, we think that it will be more approachable to modern audiences in our 21st century audience than the current stories, which are focused on the folk magic and the seerstone context of the Book of Mormon, which we believe is just superstition, that it's in a historical record. We don't deny that, but we think that it's not really relevant and should be left behind in appreciating why the Book of Mormon is the way it is.
Let me invite people, our participants, then to go to the reactions point on the bottom of the screen. Wave your hand if our mentor is with us. Deb has been watching, keeping things in order. I would like to get one more question in before I turn it over, though, because as I remember, Jane Manning indicated that when she went through Lucy Mack Smith's room in Nauvoo, in the mansion house, that Lucy volunteered her to carry a bundle and let her feel the Urim and Thummim and told her that's what she was feeling. Any means of accounting for that?
Yes, this is something we address in the book. So the term, one of the reasons that in the book we tried to use the term interpreters, because the term Urim and Thummim it's a problematic term. It's not the original term. The first time we see it is 1832, and it came to be used more loosely than just meaning the interpreters. And so one of the arguments of people who advocate the seer stone in the hat explanation is that anything that refers where the Urim and Thummim is referred to, it could be either the interpreters or the seer stones. Now, we address that in the book in detail. And our argument is that, yes, again, it is true that the term Urim and Thummim began to be used rather loosely later on, but we go through the actual translation accounts themselves, and if you look at them closely, it becomes clear that when talking about the translation, there always was a distinction between the seer stone and the interpreters, even by those who advocated the seer stone. The greatest advocate of the seer stone in the hat was David Whitmer, but even he, and we have interviews with him from the 1880s, even he used the term Urim and Thummim only to refer to the interpreters, and he referred to the seer stone as a separate object. So what Lucy was probably using the term to refer to a seer stone, it had more than one seer stone, but that was a loose use that does exist. But we argue, and I think we try to show in the book the evidence that when it came to actually describing in translation, everyone always made that distinction between the Urim and Thummim. That term was only used to apply to the interpreters. The seer stone was a separate object.
Thank you.
So that would be my, our view of why that was that particular incident you're describing.
Okay, let's open the forum to the other questions then.
Okay, we got 4 people so far, Stephen and then Ed. Go ahead, Stephen, please.
Well, first of all, James, I wanted to thank you for giving me a ride from Salt Lake City to Logan, Utah. Really appreciate it.
Hey.
Mormon History Association.
It was a pleasant trip. I enjoyed getting to know you.
Yeah, and it was great to just kind of have preliminary discussions about your work that you are doing with Jonathan. I just have a couple questions. First of all, what kind of response have you been getting from people? Now, what I find interesting is that there seems to be a lot of hostility to anybody that wants to bring in new and different ideas, whether it's geographic models of the Book of Mormon or looking at perhaps there were 2 sets of plates as opposed to 1 set of plate. And what I find so fascinating as an outsider is that I know you don't like to use the term naturalistic, but I do think that what you and Jonathan are presenting is a more naturalistic, rational explanation of how the Book of Mormon is coming forth. That as an evangelical, it makes it much more accessible and less of a magical and occult, using an occult object to translate scripture makes the Book of Mormon very scary to outsiders. So that's why I like the naturalistic, but I understand where you're coming from, because of course I think your theory is 99% naturalistic and 1% supernatural, which I think makes more sense to me as opposed to a stone that has these words magically appear on it. Now we're talking about 99% supernatural and 1% naturalistic. But I guess and my follow-up to that is, one is your responses, what you've been getting, but also how do you differentiate your view of using a cell phone analogy of the seer stone with Brad Wilcox also using a similar analogy of the seer stone as a type of cell phone, if you will?
Okay, thank you for those questions. So first of all, as far as the reactions that we're getting, that I haven't been getting much because we're just putting this out there. It's in the hands of, the manuscript is in the hands of publishers, but just barely. I presented another piece of the book at the Mormon History Association, and I'm told that it created some stir, but I never got any personal feedback to it. You might put that question to Jonathan, who's of course been out there and much more public than I have. Of course, Jonathan has gotten some hostile reaction, not so much on this, but on a lot of the other things that he's advocated. So far, there hasn't been a lot of pushback on the particular theory that I just presented, mostly, but most people haven't heard this particular theory yet either. So so far, it's been quiet, but the storm, there may be a storm still coming. So as far as the Brad Wilcox, the comparison, what they are doing. So what has happened is that in the last years, there has been an effort on part of the LDS Church to, try to open up the historical record and acknowledge the historical record. And traditionally, in the LDS Church, there was not much acknowledgement of the seer stone accounts. And they are in the historical record. There's no question about that. They're in the historical record. So there was efforts to open up the historical record and acknowledge that there are these seer stone accounts. We think that has gone overboard, that the acknowledgement was made of the seer stone accounts, but nobody has dug into them to put them in context and test whether they're really reliable, which we tried to do in this book. And as I said, our conclusion is that they are not very reliable. But nonetheless, so in the LDS scholarly community, there has been a kind of a consensus rise, which accepts the seer stone accounts. So the question, so comparing the comparison to a cell phone, basically the issue is how could a little object produce the text of the Book of Mormon? So I think that Brad Wilcox, in making that analogy, he was clearly referring to the seer stone because he's accepted the seer stone account, and then we hope that after he reads our book, he'll change his mind, but we'll see. He basically, if you look at the video that is made of him advocating that, he's saying, he's addressing the issue of how could the Book of Mormon text come from something so small as a seer stone? And from the point of view of our argument, you could ask the same question about the Urim and Thummim. I mean, the spectacles were big, but they weren't that big. So how could the Book of Mormon text come from there? And in that case, the cell phone analogy works both ways. I don't think that the seer stone is how it happened, but the analogy is useful in that it explains to a modern person, a 21st century person, how it is that you get this whole 500 plus page book text out of some small object. And that was the point he was making. And to the extent that the point goes to how could you get a big book out of a little object, it's a fair analogy that he made. He just didn't have the benefit of reading our research yet to know that, in fact, he should have been talking about the Urim and Thummim, the Nephite Jaredite interpreters, rather than the seer stone in making his analogy. So anyway, that's how I'd respond to that.
Okay, Brian made a comment. He appreciates it. It was interesting and very good, James. That came from
Thank
Brian. Ed Founts, go ahead, please.
Yes, this is a very interesting presentation, but I'll start the pushback a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I don't find any problem at all with people getting confused about the interpreters and seer stones. If anything, people today understand we live in a magnetic digital universe, and being able to get the full text of the Encyclopedia Britannica is no problem. We've got readers, you get it a sentence at a time, a word at a time, a page at a time. So that's really, to me, I don't see any problem at all with that. But there are two aspects of your explanation that I wonder about. Number one, it's one thing to get the text of the golden plates. It's quite another thing to produce it as a Hebrew book of poetry, where the order of the words and the precise words are so important. one cannot just go quickly over chiasmus and all the various Hebraic forms that you find in the Book of Mormon, because if Joseph was concocting the Book of Mormon out of his interpretations of an impression that he had, the chances that he would have put those words in the order that they had to show the parallelisms, the chiasms, and all the other, I mean, there's like 100 different Hebraic forms that are found in the Book of Mormon. There's no way he could have done that because he didn't know it. And the quote that you give from the Doctrine and Covenants, I've thought about that a lot. You notice that the instructions given to Oliver didn't work. They're wrong, at least as far as Oliver was concerned. Study it out in his mind. What part of studying it out in his mind could he possibly have used to read the characters on the gold plate and then transcribe it into Hebrew poetry? And that's another thing I have a problem with. You say that he had plenty of time to write the book. If Joseph had to study it out in his mind with all the complexity and structure that you pointed out, you were an attorney. I was an attorney for 50 years. I can tell you, I had a specialty. And when I wrote briefs for courts, I had to study it out in my mind. I would spend sometimes several days working out a point. I don't think he couldn't possibly have had enough time to put this book in the format that he got. And the professor who wants to lead us along to eliminate to put it into more naturalistic context rather than supernatural, says he had to use the King James version of the Bible. But the problem is that the Skousen group just reported within the last, I don't know, less than 10 years, that that language, the modern early English language, is a dead language at the time that Joseph wrote. And it would have been a dead language to the people who were reading it. But the only party that could have given us, the one party or the one character that could have given us the proper contextual understanding of what's on the golden plates and put it into English language, you dismissed at the beginning by saying we put the three Nephites aside. They were the bridge between the Nephites and people who could speak English living in the world at the time that, or who could have produced the text that Joseph was shown in his iPad, whatever it was, to give us this Book of Mormon. And to redo the book in terms of language for new groups of people, where we put it into language that they would recognize, you would lose the most interesting and I would say compelling testimony of the book that it was a Hebrew book, that it is a book that reflects the Hebrew poetry. And to me, that was the most amazing thing I got out of it when I did the work I did on it.
Well, if I could, I'm actually agreeing with you about 80%. I probably did not articulate it very well, but our argument is that one of the we don't believe that Joseph Smith wrote it, And we argue that one of the arguments against that is, in fact, this complex structure and all of these Hebraic language structures in the book. So we agree with you. I mean, I agree with you on that is a critical aspect of the book, and one of the strong evidences that this was not invented by Joseph Smith. What we're arguing is that the way that structure got carried through and the Hebrew language artifacts got carried through into the English text was that was how he got it from the Urim and Thummim. So you have in the structure of the Book of Mormon, it's a double structure. On the one hand, there's lots of 1820s type of English. On the other hand, as you've pointed out, there's this substrata of Hebraic forms and poetry that is in English, but in these odd word orders and so forth, just like you've explained. And yet the English is the English of the 1820s. So it's a double structure. Well, we argue that it is, and I gave you the link. Go look at Jonathan's database. But the point is that it's got, how do you account for this double structure? I mean, even if it was in early modern English, it's still in English and not Hebrew. So how is it that the Book of Mormon text, whether it's early modern English or 1820s English, how is it that it has this substrata of Hebraic forms and so forth that you described? So our explanation for that is that that's what Joseph was getting from the Urim and Thummim. The Urim and Thummim was giving him the very literalistic version of the text, and that he rephrased a lot of it into language of his time, which explains why the vocabulary all is from the 1820s. But he was, it flowed through, the Hebraic structures flowed through because that's what he was working from. So we believe our explanation explains both these linguistic features of the Book of Mormon, the fact that the language is, a lot of it is from Joseph's environment, but there is this substrata of Hebraic language forms and so forth that also are found in this English text. Now, with regard to the early modern English, we deal with that in the book, address it at length. It's a bit of a convoluted argument, and I'm for purposes of this group, because I see there's a few other people with questions, I'm gonna beg you to pass on that question. Let me pass on that question and just refer you to the book when it comes out, and we address the early modern English argument so we can get to some of the other folks. But your suggestion that the Book of Mormon is at base a Hebrew book, and that can be seen in the English translation, we agree with you on that. We're just trying to explain how that happened, how you get this. So that's we have our theory kind of accounts for that feature of the book, which is a very significant feature, as you say, as you correctly point out.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, I think move on to next person.
Okay, I think that's
Sorry, it's Eric. Yeah, and then Rick.
all right. Want to say first off, really enjoyed the presentation. I myself am currently in the process of creating a transliteration of the Book of Mormon into Hebrew using 6th century BC Hebrew, not a modern Hebrew. And one of the things that I found early on was the wording in the Book of Mormon adheres to the prefixes and suffixes that you find in 6th century BC Hebrew very, very closely. Almost, I dare say, like 95, 98% of the time. And so observation I make is it's not that the Book of Mormon mimics the King James style. It's just that the King James being a formal translation of Hebrew, the Book of Mormon is also a formal translation of Hebrew. So in that respect, they sound the same because they're both formal translations of the underlying Hebrew.
Okay, that's a very reasonable point. So I think I think I would agree with you on that. But thank you. That's fascinating. And obviously, I'd be very fascinated to see your project that you're just describing. At what point are you far away from publication, tend never to publish, or?
I'm about a little over 96% done with kind of the first draft. And
Okay.
I put it out there on my website. It's bookofmormoninfo.com. You can see it there. About every month I update it with the last, previous month's worth of work, but it's getting close to the first draft.
Okay. All right. Well, look, be very interested to see that.
Thank you.
Okay. Rick, go ahead, please, and then Brian.
Okay, thanks, James, for filling in, and you have a great mastery of the English language. The question I have about what your presentation was, the Book of Mormon doesn't follow exactly the King James Version. And so I'm wondering, if Joseph used the King James Version, why is the Book of Mormon King James Version different than the King James Version?
Good question. And sort of overlaying, and I maybe didn't emphasize this enough in my presentation, but overlaying the whole process was the guidance of the Holy Spirit. So basically, our argument would be that Joseph and Oliver were tracking the King James, unless either the translation they were getting from the Urim and Thummim differed in some way, or the Holy Spirit told them, write it this way, even though the King King James Bible is saying it differently. So we would acknowledge that there were, as you point out, there are in fact differences, and so that's how we would explain those differences as being part of this.
So you would say
inspired
that
process.
Yeah, so you would say the Isaiah in the Book of Mormon is more inspired or more accurate than the Isaiah in the King James Bible itself, because of the additions that the Holy Spirit gave them.
Well, let's put it this way: as to how close or not close it is to some old Hebrew text, I don't know. That's not my area of expertise.
Okay.
It may be, as we learned from the fact that Joseph did his new Bible translation, it could be that that's how the original read, and the Holy Spirit was telling Joseph, write it a little differently.
Yeah.
Because even the original Hebrew is not the very best version of this revelation.
Yeah.
So that's another possibility.
Okay, next question. In quotes that are recorded in the Book of Mormon from God or from Jesus, did Joseph paraphrase those, or did he get those quotes word for word in English?
Let's put it this way: our view is that if he wasn't tracking the King James Bible, and these are new words from Jesus or God, that what he was doing was he was getting the Nephite version of those sayings. In other words, those were written down by the Nephite authors in Nephite, and what Joseph was getting from the Urim and Thummim was a very literalistic translation of what the Nephites wrote of what they understood God and Jesus to have said.
Right. So when God speaks to Lehi and Nephi, if you keep my commandments, you'll prosper in the land. If you don't keep my commandments, you will be cut off from my presence. So that would have been an English translation of what God the Father or Jesus would have said in the Nephite tongue.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Next is no erasures. I'm sure you're probably familiar with no erasures in the Book of Mormon. Okay. Were they inserted by Joseph, or were they inserted by the original writers and inscribers to correct something that needed clarification?
I'm afraid now you're going beyond my own personal expertise. So I'm
Okay.
afraid that you know, our theory is we're presenting a theory for the first time, and I'm sure that if people are attracted to it, that there will be a lot of elaborations, and that would be a point that might be studied further.
Yeah, I just heard it explained that when the inscribers were putting the words down on the plates, and they said, "Oh, it really doesn't sound right. I need to clarify, you know, their secret parts being shielded, that they're going to add more information." But if Joseph is writing it down, he wouldn't really need to put those in there, because he could have fixed it in the transcribing process. You know.
Well, okay, this is not something we really get into that level of
Okay.
detail in our
We'll skip
book,
that one
but
then.
no, but I would say that my suspicion, since those things do appear in the Book of Mormon, you know, in other words, that I suspect that the Urim and Thummim were giving him that text as a, you know, it was just translating what it was on the gold plates, and Joseph was just, you know, he was taking it the way that it was, the Urim and Thummim was giving it to him.
Okay.
You know, trying to turn it into 1820s English, but mainly he was putting down what the gold plate said.
Okay.
He was tracking the gold plates.
Right. You know, I mentioned about Isaiah not being a word for word with King James. Malachi also, the Malachi in the Book of Mormon is different than the Malachi in the King James Bible. But anyway, the interpreters that were either that the brother Jared got to include with his bundle of plates or his writings, he was supposed to include them, the interpreters. Do you have a theory as to who made those?
Well, it's, you know, in the account in the Book of Ether, it's sort of a wondrous thing that, you know, he receives these, but we would suggest the analogy to, again, to technology. You know, the belief in I think all the restoration traditions is that God is the master engineer of the universe. He understands all laws. He acts and works in accordance with all laws. So we would suggest that however the interpreters were produced, however they were manufactured, to use modern terminology, it was, you know, a divine process that infused the laws of nature. And that's why we feel it's comfortable, well, you know, quite certain that the interpreters were, you know, we compare them to modern technology, but I'm sure that they are far beyond our technology that we know. But we feel comfortable making the comparison because of this, you know, understanding in the restoration that God is the master and, you know, architect of the universe, and he does things that work according to the physical laws of the universe. And so
I was just wondering, you were talking about the interpreters being like of Joseph Smith era, or maybe you know, earlier on, you know, when the 24 plates are translated, or the stone that Coriantumr brought. But if they're the same interpreters, then they had a much earlier origin.
Oh yes.
Okay.
If you you know, if in fact, and I think this is the best interpretation, those objects that were in the box with the gold plates were the original interpreters that were given to the first American prophets. They were much older than the gold plates. They're the truly ancient artifact that Joseph was given by Moroni.
Okay. Thank you for your time and presenting to us, and thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. Okay, Brian and then Frank. Go ahead, Brian.
Hey, first of all, very good, James. I enjoyed that. In fact, I've thought many of the same thoughts over the years. Just 2 points. One is I used to work for the translation department when I was a grad student at U of U as a part-time job, and it was fun and interesting. And I find your words on the translation of Isaiah interesting because yes, that what you said helps make a little more sense, because the King James Version was the esteemed text of the day. One thing I've always been bothered by is the verse in 2nd Nephi chapter 12 verse 9, which corresponds to 2nd Isaiah chapter 2 verse 9. The mean man boweth not down, and the great man humbleth himself not. In the Hebrew, that is, the mean man just is ish. It's just one word. It means a common man. So the mean doesn't really mean mean, as in vicious and violent. It means the common man. And the great man is, actually the mean man is Adam, a lower level, lower class. So these are talking about two different classes of men, a common man and the upper class man. So Adam and Ish, the Hebrew simply uses two different words for man. The Spanish Isaiah does an excellent job of translating that in using hombre for the first one and varón, baron, for the second one, a little higher class. So it uses two different words for man. It conveys really nicely that we have a common man and a man of a higher class. But in the Spanish of the Book of Mormon, we have el hombre vil, the vile man, for the mean man. And so, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And when you look at the Hebrew, the translation from the Hebrew to the King James Version, and then the Book of Mormon corresponds to a degree to the King James, and then you translate that into Spanish. The Spanish of the Bible and the Spanish of the Book of Mormon are 4 translations removed. And I actually sent a letter to the translation department 30 years after I worked there to explain that it might be good to just kind of look at because the Spanish translation for that particular verse anyway is wonderful. Whereas we kind of messed up the English translation. So yeah, a lot of work to be done in those areas yet. And I really appreciated your words. One more thought is that the idea that it was a combination of thinking, as you mentioned, through things, as well as seeing or receiving or confirmation of best wording or whatever. I also found interesting because I often looked at Joseph Smith's experience. He received the plates in 1827, and the translation was completed in 1829. And even though there was some translation that happened, as is noted, most of the translation happened in the last 2 or 3 months, most of it, But and so he had the plates for most of 2 years, and it might have been like our typical missionaries. I mean, he was a missionary age basically, and maybe he was given that time to study it and learn the language. It's just like a missionary today. It takes a couple of years to learn the language that he deals with or must deal with shortly. And so he might have been, and he tutored by Moroni frequently, so he might have been studying the language of those plates so that he could read them to a degree, and again with help from the Spirit and whatever. So everything you said I found very interesting and compatible and very good. I don't really have any questions. I just wanted to add those couple comments.
I'll just add one comment to the point you just made. I mean, Joseph did himself say in one of his accounts that the first thing he did was to use the Urim and Thummim to copy out characters. And that's where the Martin Harris document came from, was Joseph did use the Urim and Thummim. He says that he used it to translate some of the characters, and that was one of his first activities he did. So there's actually historical record evidence that he was kind of trying to start with to learn the basics, at least, of understanding the Nephite characters. So that account is in our book, so you can you can see the reference to that when it's in when our book comes.
Anyway, very interesting.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Frank Fry, you're next.
Get myself unmuted here. First of all, before I go into the couple of comments that I want to make, thank you. I apologize again for getting here late. I enjoyed what I heard. Before I forget here, Rick, you asked about the no erasures, and that I think I would agree with what James is saying here, that the no erasures were mistakes that were on the plates. You can't erase something that's on a metal plate, and so they had to make some kind of correction or start another plate. They had that choice, and they chose not to. So I don't have a problem with those at all. Then I've got about 3 or 4 things here I just want to comment on. How do you get something that big out of something that small? Talking about, the Book of Mormon out of those stones. Well, first of all, I don't think that the Book of Mormon came from those stones. It was a medium that the Lord used to give the message of the Book of Mormon to him. Talking about something small, I used to have, and I can still probably buy another one. I saw it recently on the internet, a 1-inch square piece of microfilm that had the entire King James Bible on it. And you could only read it with a microscope. And I looked at it many times under my little microscope, and you could read every word of it, clear as a bell. So you can get, a lot of small things magnified into big things. And then there was the prophet in the book in the Bible that sent a prophetic message to the king, and he burned it. And the Bible says that the prophet rewrote the message, and the Lord added more to it. So I don't have a problem with that either. The simplest answer, in my opinion, is the fact that, we were told that it was translated by the gift and power of God. And I think that's the simplest answer and the best answer. It was done by the gift and power of God. I don't think that Joseph Smith did a lot of analysis of the words. I think they were given to him. I think that there were many changes in the between the 1830 edition and the next edition of the Book of Mormon. A lot of those were scribal errors, and many of those still haven't been corrected. I've been studying a lot about the translation of the King James Bible recently, and it took 3 editions to get most of the errors from the typographers, the guys that were setting the type.
The printers errors, yeah.
Printers, it took at least 3 editions of it to get most of them out, and there's one, at least one that I know of is still there, but not a big deal. I mean, we know what it's supposed to say. And there's still things in the Book of Mormon. There's one place where it says that in Nephi, where he has a vision and he sees into the future, when the Lord comes, there's a great destruction. And I've mentioned this on here before, but the fact is, it says that by Nephi, it says those who had fallen were the ones that saw the Lord when he came, And then when you get over to 3rd Nephi, where it describes the exact occurrence, it repeats the language almost, not exactly, but almost. And it says those who had not fallen were the ones who saw the Lord. And that just makes it very clear that it was a natural volcanic event where if you'd fallen down, you would have been suffocated. And that very kind of thing has happened in other places of the world. There was a place in Africa where that happened. And it's been speculated that's why the firstborn of Egypt died. Why they died, because they were laying on the ground and the parents were, or the others were laying in beds that were up off the floor. Yeah, I don't know whether that's true or not. I kind of doubt that. But it is a fact that there were hundreds of people who died during a volcanic type event because they were sleeping on the ground. Anyway, thank you for your presentation again, and enjoyed what I got to hear.
Okay, I understand these are recorded, so you can go back and listen to the full recording that
I
Robert
do
will be
that.
putting out.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Jonathan, looks like you're next. Thanks for your patience.
Okay, I just made a note here on that, the question about in other words. That's one of those non-biblical Edwardsian, Jonathan Edwards phrases that he used over 100 times in his work. And it's interesting because the way Jonathan Edwards used it was he would say something and then he would say in other words or in other words and re-say it slightly differently. It wasn't because he was correcting himself. It was because he was providing another explanation of the concept he was trying to say. And so when I see that in the Book of Mormon, to me, that's Joseph Smith struggling with what's the best way to say this. Here's one way, or in other words, here's another way. That's how I see it.
You're talking about something that I just said. I'd like to respond to that.
Yeah.
Some of those that we call no erasures are completely reversed. So it wasn't a matter of him trying to figure out how to say it. He made a mistake and he's trying to correct it.
Well, and that's the same thing, because they were taking, in the process of translating, he could correct mistakes as he was going, but his scribes were recording everything verbatim.
Oh, I
And
see what
so-
you're saying. Yeah.
So
Okay.
whether it was he was correcting his translation or expressing in another way, to me, those are both evidence of him actually translating an ancient record. So that I don't need to say much more. I have a whole bunch of notes here, but I just wanted to bring that up because, in the context of how Jonathan Edwards' terminology and use of the language appears so often, and that's one of the really interesting examples, because Joseph actually used that phrase more in the Doctrine and Covenants than he did in the Book of Mormon, which is another interesting concept, because he was, in fact, I pulled it up here just as an example. That phrase, in other words, appears 13 times in the Book of Mormon, but 23 times in the Doctrine and Covenants. So to me, that's another indication that it was his way of expressing how he was trying to articulate the word of God in his mind. So
But in the Book of Mormon, there's more of those that are where they use the word or and or rather.
yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't pull those up, but just the phrase "in other words."
Okay.
And it's more common in the Doctrine and Covenants. In fact, I think it's even in Joseph Smith history he used that phrase.
Yeah, I don't consider a lot of those corrections. I consider those,
Right.
That's a different issue in my mind. Thank you anyway.
Exactly. And it's nowhere in the Bible. So, okay. Anyway, that's enough.
Okay, thank you. David DeBarth, you're next, and then Richard.
Thank you, James. As a lifetime member of the Community of Christ and with secular training in science and a career in science, I like it. I think it gives us a wonderful foundation for continued study and research and exploration. I love that. Carry on, brother. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Richard, go ahead, please.
You were mentioning to James Lucas. You were talking.
Richard, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Back in the 70s, there was some linguistic analyses that were identified as word prints. And when applied to the Book of Mormon, this technique concluded that the quoted text within each contributors section of the book represented a unique individual. And even the very, very shortest of books indicated that they were not the major speakers like Nephi, Lehi, so on and so forth. Anyway, the first thing I would look at if I had a copy of your book in hand would be to see if there's any evidence that was presented back then in your understanding of the translation.
Well, we don't discuss the word prints in the book. It's a short book and it tries to get through a lot of material, but we also try to keep it fairly short and accessible. So we don't really address the issue of word prints because word prints are a very complicated issue. Because of course, I'm familiar with what you're referring to about the word print analysis of the Book of Mormon, but of course, there's been people who've attacked that and said that the word print analyses that were done on the Book of Mormon that proved that it was multiple authors were, not properly done, and so on and so forth. So we kind of stepped away. We just did not get into that particular issue. But the idea that the Book of Mormon contains different voices, I think that's evident even without word prints. I mean, you just read it as and there are literary analysts, there we go, who have studied the Book of Mormon and published books who speak about, just from the literary style of the various authors, how distinctive Nephi is from Mormon and, Enos is from Moroni and so forth, without referring to the word print studies. And I think, those are very valid, points that those literary critics have made, just pointing out, just as a very amateur person, it was obvious to me, even the very first time that I read the Book of Mormon, that, Nephi was a very different kind of writer than Mormon. And I think that, anybody who's reading the text will immediately see that they're hearing different people talk and have very different approaches to things. So I think that, and in our theory, that the explanation as to why that carries through into the translated English text would be that Joseph was getting this very literalistic translation from the Urim and Thummim that would preserve these idiosyncrasies of the various authors, and that carried through into his restatement of their words in his translation.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, we have Ed and then Frank. Go ahead, please, Ed.
Yes, I forgot to mention one thing. When you quoted the section 9 of the Doctrine and Covenants on instructions to Oliver if he was going to translate. One of the other sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, however, puts a nuance on that, because after Joseph had the experience of losing the 116 pages, he was told he lost his gift. If his gift could be exercised by his studying it out in his mind, of course, it goes on to say, you have to ask me if it's correct, but apparently he even lost the gift of being able to study it out in his mind. Now, if he knew the language, if he taught it to himself in the 2 years that he had access to Moroni, but he didn't really have access to the place, I don't believe, for that entire time. That's a nuance to this whole thing of studying it out in your mind. See, here's my problem. I am afraid that in the long run, the more we try to give Joseph's mind, the more we try to identify what contemporary language he was using, the less his role as a prophet bringing forth the word of God. I just see that as diminishing it. And that's why I have those problems. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that.
Okay, I mean, that's a fair point. I think our response, or at least my response to that, would be that I don't see looking at Joseph's role in doing his the translation being an intellectual task that he was given by the Lord, to be diminishing his role, because if you look at the history of God's interaction with humanity, God is always speaking through prophets, and the personality and the talents and not lack of talents of the prophets very clearly factor into how they fulfill their missions. So I don't see, Joseph being an actively engaged translator as diminishing him in comparison to Moses or Peter or Mormon, who clearly also brought their personalities to the missions that God gave them, and that impacted on how they fulfilled the missions that God gave them. So that would be sort of, that's how I'd respond to your concern, which I acknowledge is a valid concern, and I understand your concern, but that's how I would respond to that.
Okay, but I wasn't concerned that it would diminish Joseph's standing. Joseph at one time said that the Book of Mormon was words to the effect of the most perfect book in the English language. What I think he was really trying to indicate was, hey folks, I didn't write this book. This book was given to me. And it was given to me by the gift and power of God. If he had said, well, I made this up as best I could, I used my mind and so forth, people could be much more skeptical of it. And that's why I think the bridge between the plates and the translation that was given to Joseph has got to include the three Nephites. After all, when in 3rd Nephi, Jesus is talking to the man Nephi, the apostle or a disciple he was called, and he says, didn't I tell you to put such and such in there? And he said, yes. He says, where is it? Oops. And he said,
they left out Samuel the Lamanite. They left out Samuel the Lamanite. It's the specific reference here.
The resurrection that he prophesied. Yeah.
So we know. I mean, you're absolutely right. And you said God works, Jesus or God works through men. But here we have actual men who asked to be allowed to continue living because they said they wanted to bring their words to their descendants. And when you put those aside and say, well, we're not going to deal with those are the very people that have the capability to both extract the meaning from the gold plate and to put it into English because they were alive and they have the capacity to learn that. And how can we put those aside? There's nobody else.
So actually, I will make this point, and this is a much more elaborate discussion than we could probably want to get into on this Zoom call. But Jonathan and I actually are big 3 Nephite fans. We don't believe that they translated the Book of Mormon, but we do believe they were actively present in New York, helping out with the translation, the Joseph's project, or the translation project. We don't think they were the translators, but there are several accounts. Like, for example, there's a very famous account when David Whitner has gone to Harmony to collect Joseph and Oliver, and they're going up to Fayette, New York, to finish the translation. And David has described to many people an incident that happened where they came across a stranger on the road as they were riding along the road on a buggy to go from Harmony to Fayette. and they stopped, and the stranger was an elderly man, they described with a knapsack on his back, and they offered him a ride, and the man said, thank you, but I'm going to Cumorah. And David Whitmer, this struck him because it was the first time he'd ever heard the term Cumorah. And he retold this story many times to many people. And it's left out of modern accounts because, of course, the people don't like to identify the hill in New York as the hill Cumorah. But so then the gentleman kind of disappeared. And, David and Oliver turned to Joseph and said, well, who is that? And Joseph said, that's one of the three Nephites. He's carrying the plates, and he was carrying the plates in his knapsack to take them back to the hill Cumorah. And so later, when you recall the incident when Mary Whitmer is shown the plates, in later accounts, they changed it to say Moroni, but in the early accounts, Mary Whitmer said the man introduced himself as Brother Nephi. And in his descriptions of the accounts, David Whitmer always identified the man who came to see his mother as being the same man they had encountered on the road to Fayette, and said that, that was Nephi of the three Nephites. So we actually strongly believe that the three Nephites were tasked with helping out with this whole project. Moroni was this angel resurrected being who could only, who appeared in light and wonders and so forth. But, who carried the plates around, who got the, went from here to there and ran, basically engaged in all of this physical labor. Well, we believe it was the three Nephites, that they were around and carrying out tasks to help out with the whole project of getting the Book of Mormon translated. So while we disagree that they were translators, we do agree very strongly that they were present in the 1820s period and helping out very actively with the whole project of getting the Book of Mormon going. So that's a different subject, but it's I just point that out that
they were not only present in the 1820s when the Book of Mormon was being produced, or just before it was, but they were also present on this earth in the 15th and 16th centuries when the English was early modern English. That's the inescapable fact that's missing.
Oh, well, that they were around, no doubt, you're correct, that they translated the Book of Mormon into early modern English. Like I said, I'd have to ask you to defer that discussion to the book, and
Okay,
we address all that in the book. But we agree with you that the three Nephites were around and active and carried out important tasks in connection with the Book of Mormon. So on that point, we can agree.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've tried to figure out who it could be, but I don't know anybody who lived in who were actual alive in both of those time periods. I don't know anybody else. So anyway.
Okay, well, if you're,
I'll wait.
I guess okay, but we're forming a Three Nephites fan club, and you're welcome to join.
Okay.
Okay, Frank, go ahead, please.
I'll join that fan club too.
Okay.
I believe
Good.
they've been active right up to the present here. I just wanted to share a testimony, a personal testimony. I've been involved with the translation of the Book of Mormon in 2 different languages now, and I've translated many other materials in one of those languages. And as I was working with some men over in Kenya with the Book of Mormon into Swahili, I can't remember exactly where it was when I got to that point, but somewhere in the middle of the book, I suddenly the realization came to me, and my major was in Spanish and language linguistics, and and the teaching of second language. But it really came to my consciousness very, very strongly at a certain point when we're about halfway through or so, that this book was not what we're looking at in English and trying to struggle to put in another language. That wasn't the original language that book was printed in, because it wasn't our current English. It was not just Joseph Smith's English. I know enough about the King James Bible, and our inspired version was based on that King James Bible. So, but it was just impressed on me very strongly that this book was not written in English. I mean, there's been all kinds of people have tried to say, well, somebody just invented this in the 19th century. They didn't do that, because the struggle with the words, trying to put them in the proper format so that we might understand them. There's a process in your mind when you're trying to translate something, and I do that all the time with Spanish. But there I was trying to do it again with Swahili. And not that I learned a lot of Swahili, but I saw the process that these men were going through, and I watched it, and I saw the words as they were being formed and the sentences being formed. And I realized this was not written in our language, in English. It was written in another language. And we're the benefactors of that in our language, but it was a struggle to get it there. Anyway.
No, thank you for that testimony, because we completely agree with that. To account for the Book of Mormon, you have to, it's on the surface it's written in 1820s English, but it has the substrata of ancient forms, Hebraic poetry, and just rich complexity that you simply can't account for why the Book of Mormon is the way it is unless you can account for how that substrata of ancient language artifacts flowed through into the English text. And so that's what we hope. One of the things we were trying to do with coming up with our approach was to take that into account, which obviously the composition advocates, they just ignore that. Even though there's many people who've explored and explained the substrata of ancient language artifacts that you're discussing are flow through our parent in the Book of Mormon, even in the English translated English text. Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, looks like Nancy and her brother have been sitting there waving their hands like crazy. So go ahead.
Oh my goodness.
You have to unmute.
Gotta unmute. We're playing charades now.
I can't even see them.
Oh, can you unmute her?
No.
Okay, so that can't, Nancy, they can't unmute you.
Them to unmute. I cannot unmute them.
Okay, so I guess
Can you type it in the chat? No, you can't, because you ain't at the computer. Never mind.
Yeah, apparently they can't get to the computer or something, or may not be able to. Maybe they're looking at it from a projected image on the ceiling or something. I don't know. We appreciate your efforts.
Okay, keep trying. Paul, I guess I'm not. Oh, I need to sign off. Jonathan, thanks for joining us. It was great to have you with us.
Thanks, buddy.
Nancy.
All right, there we go.
Hey, sorry about that. Modern technology is wonderful.
Okay.
Well, on the same theme that Frank was talking about different languages and trying to go from one to the other, we also have to keep recognizing that yes, this was in a Hebrew language they were using, but they were using Egyptian script. So
Correct.
another
Making it
layer
even more complicated.
to make
Yeah.
it even more
Yes.
complicated,
Right.
right?
Yes, yes,
So
yes.
we have to keep that in mind that there's so many layers here. It's a real complicated deal.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I just wanted to ask you, James, to please repeat the name of your book because I want to get it when it comes out.
Okay, it's where does the Book of Mormon come from? Question mark. A neo-Orthodox view of its origins, translation, and destiny. Actually, I should maybe write that in the chat. If let's see. So I'm not a fast typist, but that's what it is. And
Thank you.
now it could be we don't have a publisher yet, so it could be they'll come up with some other title, but this is what we're starting with.
Yeah.
Let's see. Whoops. Okay.
Thanks for joining us, Nathan. It was good to have you.
And I really, really appreciate this. It was a lot of things made so much sense. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, we hope that I hope a lot of other folks. Oh, here we go. I see. I'm going to finish typing it out in the chat here. Thank you. I hope that a lot of other people also find it convincing and useful. Okay, where's the Book of Mormon? Okay.
We are beyond 10:15, so let me sing us out and invite people to continue afterwards. The Lord is blessing me right now, right now. I feel it here right now in my soul. I may not be able to see what the Lord has for me, but I know it's blessing me now, right now. Good night to all of you that need to leave early, and I just want to continue to discuss.
Good night.
James,
Good night,
James, I
Paul.
think you have to hit enter on your chat. It hasn't shown up in the chat yet.
I've not finished typing it.
Oh, good reason.